Several of you in your nature immersion journals talked about the sense of well-being that you had during that experience. And we're going to talk about some of the scientific evidence for that today, which is referred to as biophilia. So these are just some questions to think about as you're listening to this lecture. One, just what is biophilia and how do our experiences influence biophilia? What is the evidence for it? And how do people perceive and interact with the natural world more generally? So biophilia, we can start with the definition. The biologist E.O. Wilson coined the term to describe what he thought of as an evolutionary-based innate tendency to affiliate with life and lifelike processes. And what he means by lifelike processes are natural processes that are affiliated with life. So for example, things like watching water. If you think about what you feel like or how you might want to sit next to a stream and watch the water move, or sit next to a lake. Fire is another example of this, gathering around the fascination with fire as being a lifelike process. But this innate tendency, if you think about if you're a person who likes to watch birds or wildlife, or the way that you want, maybe the way that you feel when you see puppies and kittens, particularly if any of you watched the Puppy Bowl last night, for example, that this would be an example of biophilia. But according to E.O. Wilson, this link goes beyond what we can derive from the environment for physical well-being. And so it really is associated with our psychological well-being and our emotional well-being. And so talking about human identity and fulfillment that somehow depends on our relationship to nature beyond air, water, food, and so forth, to influencing emotional, cognitive, aesthetic, which means appreciation of beauty, and spiritual development. A term that's related to this was coined by Robert Michael Pyle, and that is extinction of experience. We're used to thinking about extinction of species, but think about some of the ways that people used to interact with nature but don't anymore. So, for example, outdoor play, or play in general, for some kids whose time is more and more structured in adult-led activities and those sorts of things. But there are experiences that people used to have on pretty much a daily basis or on a regular basis that they don't have anymore, that are related to interacting with nature. So think about hunting, growing and cooking food, preserving food. Some of you might have experience with things like canning or drying food, but even preparing food for an everyday purposes. A lot of people don't have the experience and foundation of doing that and the skills for doing that. Building with natural materials, using tools. Pretty much every household used to have tools, and kids would have experience using those as they were growing up, so they'd be prepared as adults. But most people outsource things that need tools to get done in their own homes. Paying attention to the seasons and being able to look around and predict the weather and understand life cycles and those sorts of things. These are all examples of extinction of experience. Fishing, not so many people fish anymore, or hunting. So I'd like you to think about, is this an important change? Does it matter that kids and, youth are not having these experiences? Is that important? And if it is, what are some of the consequences of that? Another related term is environmental generational amnesia, and this term was coined by Peter Kahn to express the fact that people tend to take the condition of the natural environment as they experienced during their childhood as the norm or the baseline. So everybody has their story about where the edge of town was, regardless of what your hometown was, when they were growing up and how much it has changed. And one of the times when he first discussed this was in relation to some property that he and his family own, which is heavily forested. And over decades he observed people coming as property would be sold, and the next person would come and think, wow, this is really beautiful, look at all these trees, I think I'll cut down some of these trees and save the others. And then when they sold, somebody would come and say, wow, this is really beautiful. Look at all these trees. I'll cut some trees and save the others, and pretty soon a lot of the trees are gone. So what was forest, complete forest, becomes much less forest, but each successive wave of people who comes thinks that that's the way it's always been. You know, here on the Great Plains, it was a prairie. And so, you know, if we think about contrasting native grassland with farmland and with certainly trees that have been planted and so forth, that this our ecosystem here in Lincoln has been changed pretty significantly. Okay, there are a couple of perspectives that I'd like to spend a few minutes contrasting, but these are perspectives on human relationship with the natural world. And think about where you fall on this continuum, because we can probably think of it as a continuum. But an anthropocentric perspective or human-centered perspective really comes from the perspective of humans dominating over other life forms and over elements and resources. So if you think about it, human manipulation of the environment is an aspect of human nature. So seeking resources, creatively designing solutions to problems like building shelters, using tools, engineering aqueducts, bridges, and so forth. And as long as humans occupy the earth, our activity is going to modify the environment. And those modifications lie in a continuum from pretty minor to very severe. So all living entities are going to manipulate the environment. One of the differences with humans, though, is that it's on a different scale. And so when we build concrete aqueducts so that rivers are running on concrete rather than above ground and below ground, for example, or when we build dams, that's an example of manipulating the environment in a way that has a lot of significant consequences beyond, for example, a beaver building a dam. But just from the perspective of rights and what's valued, a human-centered perspective really views elements of nature as being there for humans to benefit, but not necessarily having intrinsic value. But a biocentric, sometimes called ecocentric perspective, really it comes from a perspective of natural elements and life forms having intrinsic value beyond what can be exploited for human use. So, do we value specific species of plants in the rainforest because they offer potentially life-saving medicines, or do we value them because they have intrinsic value beyond the value to humans? Or for another example, are we concerned about the loss of tigers because humans will no longer be able to enjoy the majesty of the species, or because tigers themselves have intrinsic value? Or maybe closer to home, are we concerned about the loss of the Salt Creek tiger beetle because of the loss of biodiversity, or because it has intrinsic value? Stephen Keller described a variety of different ways that people could view or value nature, and these aren't mutually exclusive. Most of them aren't mutually exclusive, but think about from your own nature immersion experience which one of these would best fit in as a descriptor of your blog. So many of you describe the beauty, the physical beauty of nature. So that would be the aesthetic. Dominionistic, I was just talking about mastery and control of nature, and use of resources. It's really a hierarchical perspective. Humans above all of nature, rather than humans as a member of the community of nature. Many of you wrote about a feeling of connectedness or emotional bonding with nature, and that would be the humanistic, or being connected to something larger than yourself, and that would be the moralistic value. Naturalistic would be the exploration and discovery, and for some of you that was noticing things and having a kind of an aha experience, something you didn't realize before. And then there are people who are just really eager to know about nature, and so it's the scientific perspective to try to understand all of those interconnections. Nature is a source of language and imagination. I'll be talking about in just a minute, but symbolic as having other kinds of meaning, and you can think about poetry and art. Utilitarian would be nature as a source of material resources, so, minerals, food, water, air, and so forth. And then there certainly are a lot of people who have fear and aversion of nature, sometimes because of experiences, other times because of lack of experiences, lack of exposure to natural environments. So biophilia, or affinity for nature, is expressed a variety of different ways in cultures. And so you can think about the example of totems. Various indigenous peoples have used totems around the world. This is a characteristic of a variety of different cultures. And so if we use examples from some Native American cultures, you can think of a totem as an animal spirit guide that is with a person in this world and the next. And they're associated with specific characteristics, often characteristics of animals. So for example, a dog, the characteristics would be noble, faithful, loyal, teaching, protection, and guidance. For a crow, it would be justice, shape-shifting, change, creativity, spiritual strength, energy, community sharing, and balance. A coyote, not surprisingly, stealth, mischief, trickster, intelligence, clowning around, ability to recognize mistakes. An ant, also not surprising, group-minded, determination, patient, active, and industrious. And buffalo, sacredness, life, great strength, abundance, and gratitude. And keep in mind that, of course, in North America there were hundreds of tribes, a great deal of diversity, and the presence of totems was characteristics of some but not all tribes, and they could also have some unique meaning. But also notice that each animal is represented as a totem. It's valued for its particular strengths that you can see that are expressed by that particular animal. People interact with nature in a variety of different ways, but they also are learning from elements in nature, and so there are examples of hunting techniques that it appears were borrowed from polar bears. So in the Arctic, watching for or looking for openings and being very patient, but using very similar techniques to polar bears. Observing birds and how the shape of the wing contributes to lift. So flight principles were mimicked when people did finally successfully build airplanes. And of course, Velcro, you may be familiar with the fact that it was really modeled on the seeds that catch on your clothing when you walk around in the fall. So the hook and eye structure is what was mimicked from nature. How you conceptualize nature. For some of you, you wrote about nature as yourself and humans as being part of nature, human communities and natural communities. Some of you didn't address this directly, and some of you seem to separate people from nature. So think about how it is that you conceptualize that for yourself. The separateness is somewhat of a Western conceptualization of nature. But because there are some cultures where it is really considered to be more of a unity. And then think about deities. Cultures past and present have regarded deities in relationship to the natural world. And so, for example, many cultures worship the sun, and that's not surprising. It was probably very common because on some level people recognized that their very existence depended on the sun. All of the energy in our bodies comes from the sun through the food that we eat. And so the sun as being worshipped, people looking to and naming deities that represented natural processes is not surprising. So think about some of the representations of nature theology. Okay, so what does all this have to do with research evidence? Well, looking at the variety of different ways that people interact with nature, there have been several studies on people's preferences for views using photographs or video, sometimes views out of a window. But what these studies converge on is that people have some pretty specific preferences. So water, prominences meaning a raised view from up on high. You can imagine a hillside, a mountain, a bluff overlooking a landscape. Flowers and savanna-like environments. And the theory is that humans developed specific ways of interacting with nature that were or are adaptive. And what I mean by that is that they maximize the probability of survival. So if you are afraid of snakes, for example, you're more likely to survive to pass on the snake-fearing trait than a person who is not afraid of snakes. And so it's pretty common that people are afraid of snakes. But think about how each of these preferences might promote survival. So water, obviously, we need to be close to water because it's a life-giving resource, but also water supports a lot of other life that supports us as well. So if you're near water, you're much more likely that you're going to have trees and other plants that bear food, as well as animals that you can hunt and fish. Prominences, if you have a good view, you can see what's coming and you can also see what you might want to hunt as well. Flowers are beautiful, but they also are characteristics of plants that bear fruit. And so if you hang around places where there are flowers, you're much more likely to come across something to eat. Now, savanna-like environments. We're going to take a look at a picture here to more clearly illustrate what's meant by savanna. So a savanna is a grassland, but with trees that are separated and they don't obstruct the view. So you can see the trees in the foreground and then you can see in the background that they're scattered. They're pretty widely scattered. And so think about how this kind of a landscape might be adaptive for survival. You know, some of the characteristics are that you can see a long way. And so again, just like with a prominence, you can see if something or someone is coming, if that might be an enemy, for example, or a friend. And you can also see a long way if, for example, you're following herds to hunt. And so that's something that's also adaptive. So people have a tendency to prefer photographs of landscapes that are savanna-like. More on that in a minute, because that raises the question, what influence does your own ecosystem, your own biome have on your preferences? Okay, so I mentioned there have been several different studies of views and pictures, and generally what these studies point to is that people prefer natural environments. Think of these as greater than signs. So they prefer pictures of natural environments over pictures of built environments with natural elements. And so imagine a building, you know, it could be a beautiful, it doesn't matter if it's a beautiful building or not beautiful building, but that it's a built environment with natural elements around it, so landscaping around it. Picture, you know, on campus, maybe Love Library with the gardens around it. And they prefer that over built environments with no natural elements. And this is independent of, you know, the beauty of the building. It doesn't matter if it's a very beautiful building or not. That preference of having natural elements supersedes that. And people also prefer moderate complexity. And what this means is that we don't like to be overstimulated. We don't like pictures with too much going on, but we also don't like them to be very barren and not a lot going on at all. So kind of a mid-range there. So in terms of views and pictures, people prefer natural environments. Now back to this issue of the role of experience. A study was designed in which 8 to 11-year-olds and adolescents would view pictures of different biomes. And these were kids who lived in the Northeast, so their biome was a hardwood forest. That's their natural biome. Well, what they found is that kids 8 to 11 years old preferred savanna, but the adolescents had an equal preference for hardwood forest and savanna. And so kids were shown pictures of those two biomes as well as rainforest, boreal forest, and desert. So they were shown a variety of different places. And so by the time they were adolescents, it appears as though kids were developing a preference for their own biome that was equal to that of the savanna. But for the 8 to 11-year-olds who lived in a hardwood forest, biome their whole life, they preferred the savanna. So experience does have an influence on your preferred biome. Okay, so also, if some of you didn't live in a prairie, think about how you felt when you came here. So if you lived on either of the coasts, or you lived in mountains, or you lived in a place that had a lot of hardwood forest, think about how you felt when you came to Nebraska, or if you've moved in some way from one biome to another, or visited a place as well. You know, if you visited the desert, for example. I've lived in desert and prairie, but I also grew up in Minnesota, which is a lot of water and a lot of forest. And so coming to the prairie and also going to the desert, I felt particularly exposed, not having that canopy cover over, because I grew up in an area where there were a lot of trees. However, I've also heard people who've grown up in more prairie and desert areas report that they feel more sort of closed in when they go to a place where there's more trees. And so your own experience growing up certainly influences your preference. Now, many of you wrote about stress reduction, and certainly your anecdotal evidence carries some weight. It's very important. But to add to that, there have been now over 100 studies of spending time in a wilderness area and self-reported stress reduction, whether that was an organized outward bound program or something else. And in really what becomes a natural experiment is prison inmates, because the cell that they're assigned to is pretty much random based on availability. Well, for those prison inmates with windows that were facing farmlands and forests, they required less health care. They made fewer visits to the infirmary. And the difference between them and inmates that are facing a brick wall or a built area is greater than that could be due to chance alone. And consistent with that, dental clinic patients who were exposed to natural landscape pictures had physiologically lower heart rates, which is an indicator of reduced stress and reduced ratings of distress. This is why there may be pictures over the chair in the dental operatory, although I know a lot of dental offices now have TVs, monitors on them as well. But that's the rationale for having those landscape pictures up there. And also when you're in hospitals and other healthcare facilities, you see a lot of landscape pictures. Similarly, and all of these converge to particular findings. So when we're doing research, one study alone doesn't necessarily tell the whole story, but when you have several studies that converge on the same kinds of findings, that's very robust evidence. We can have a lot of confidence in this. So patients who are in prep for surgery, when they're exposed to natural landscape pictures, have lower blood pressure, which is an indicator of reduced stress. Similarly, this is hospital patients viewing a natural setting. It's necessary to control for the reason that people were hospitalized if you want to know what the impact of the view is on their physical recovery. And so these were hospital patients who were being treated for gallbladder conditions. So they all underwent gallbladder surgery. But those who were viewing a natural setting were discharged earlier, used less pain medication than patients viewing a brick wall. And open heart surgery patients exposed to the savanna-like picture experienced less anxiety. So there's a variety of different ways you can measure with reliability and validity people's reports of their distress and their stress reduction. So you can have self-reports, and you can also look at physiological indicators of stress reduction too. And many studies indicate that viewing natural settings is associated with stress reduction. We also know that interacting with animals can reduce stress. So if we're petting dogs, we experience a release of oxytocin, which is some people call it the love hormone, and dogs experience the release of oxytocin as well. So it's good for us, it's good for the dogs. This is also one of the reasons that there are aquariums in doctors' offices, and especially dental offices. So research where patients were randomly assigned either to contemplate an aquarium or not in the waiting room prior. Those who were contemplating aquariums experienced a decrease in blood pressure, and also that they reported that they were more relaxed in comparison to those who didn't. There's also a difference in mortality rate due to heart disease depending upon whether or not you have a pet. So if you have a pet, the mortality rate is 2/3 lower. Now, there may be a confound in that sometimes people who are not as healthy don't keep pets because they're not as able to care for them. But nevertheless, there have been a number of different studies about mortality, morbidity, and owning pets. And dementia, people who are experiencing dementia, this is the cognitive decline that is associated with conditions like Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is the most well-known form of dementia, but there are many different causes of dementia, and Alzheimer's is only one small group of patients with dementia. But for those with dementia, therapy dogs visit people who are living in assisted care facilities, and while they're interacting with animals, they have more positive emotions and they're more interactive. Apparently so are students during finals week, because therapy dogs visited many universities across the country during finals week this last year. And for children, youth, and adults with autism, they demonstrate more focused attention and social interaction, positive emotion, and verbal interaction in the presence of dogs. And a lot of schools are now adopting the practice of having a therapy dog in the school, not just for children with autism, but for children who are having difficulties or facing challenging life circumstances, having difficulties coping with stress in general. Okay, so why are natural environments restorative? There is a theory about that. It's called attention restoration theory, and it's based on the understanding that we have at least two different attentional systems. One that is directed attention, and this is the attentional system that you use when you are in a classroom or in a meeting and you have to focus. You have to actually put some effort to pay attention. So that's sometimes called voluntary attention because it is effortful. Fascination, on the other hand, is sometimes called involuntary. I don't know how involuntary it is, but it's certainly less voluntary, because fascination is really based on things that are interesting in the environment. And according to the theory, directed attention becomes fatigued. There's evidence of that. You can only do math problems for so long, you can only memorize word lists for so long, and then you need to take a little break so that your cognitive functioning can recover. So several studies have examined how different rest activities affect attention. And the way that these studies are designed is that adults, in the case of adults, they're brought in, they are fatigued, cognitively fatigued, so they are put in a task where they need to memorize word lists when their performance starts to decline, and then they're randomly assigned to a rest condition. So in one of the first studies, they compared a group that went for a walk indoors, a group that went for a walk outdoors in a built environment, so for example a downtown environment, a group that went for a walk outdoors in a natural environment, and only those who walked in a natural environment resulted in recovery of cognitive function. So the natural environment was restorative. So according to the theory, the reason that a natural environment would be restorative is that the attentional system that involves fascination is activated outdoors, and that allows the directed attention system to recover. So when you go outdoors, there are interesting things happening. There are trees moving, there are birds singing, there are sights and sounds and smells going on, but it's a moderate level of stimulation. It's not overstimulating. It's not like going to a noisy shopping mall, for example. And so because there are other interesting things going on, that allows the directed attention system to recover. It's also really important that there were two walk conditions, because that essentially controlled for the effect of exercise. It wasn't exercise because you had an indoor exercise condition, an outdoor built environment exercise condition, and an outdoor natural environment exercise condition. Some other studies have compared these walk conditions to reading magazines or listening to music and really found the same results, that it was the outdoor walk that really was effective on helping attention recover. So because of this, there have been several studies of how nature can benefit children who experience ADD and ADHD. Many of these have focused specifically on kids who are diagnosed. Others have just measured in general symptoms of attention deficits. But this first one, this was a study of elementary-aged children who were moving from homes that were less green, or in other words, surrounded by less grass, trees, shrubbery, and so forth, to homes that were more green. And it's important to note that the greenness of these homes were rated by environmental landscape students. There are rating scales for how much greenery is around homes. Now that research is done with GIS, and so you can get a pretty exact estimate of the percentage of green cover around any particular building or given a particular location. So those kids who moved to more green homes had decreased symptoms of ADHD, and that was interpreted to mean that increased proximity to natural surroundings predicted those decreased symptoms. In another study, Francis Kuo and Andrea Faber-Taylor did a large survey of parents, and the parents would just report what their kids did over the weekend and also report on their symptoms. And they found that kids who were involved in green outdoor activities such as fishing, camping, and so forth had reduced symptoms compared to kids in indoor activities or other kinds of outdoor activities. One thing that's really important is that they controlled for social context, because being with people does change attention. So whether they were alone or with others, they also controlled for physical activity level, because, for example, basketball is a physical activity that can, in physical activity alone can benefit attention because of oxygenation of the brain and other physiological processes. But playing basketball indoors versus playing basketball outdoors in an area that has trees and grass around it has a different effect. And they also controlled for age. So the results held for kids in all of the age ranges that they studied. So they separated out, because of the developmental differences in attentional control, 5 and 6-year-olds, 7 and 8-year-olds, 11 to 13-year-olds, and 14 to 18-year-olds. And they also held for all income brackets and regions of the United States, including rural and urban settings, kids who were diagnosed with an attention disorder and those who were not. And so I give you all of this information just to tell you that it was a large sample. They controlled for a lot of variables that could account for the findings, and it seems that all of the results point to the greenness of the environment as being associated with reduced symptoms of attention deficit. So they did a second parent survey following on that and asked parents just to report which activities are best and worst. And this was specifically for children who had been diagnosed with attention deficits. So 17 of the 20 activities that were nominated as best were green activities, and 50% of the activities nominated as worst for their kids were not green activities. And according to the parents' reports, the kids' symptoms were improved after green outdoor activities, but not after built outdoor activities or indoor activities. So what is a built outdoor activity? Think about, for example, maybe playing tennis on a tennis court that is surrounded by buildings. So some activity, they needed to report on the environment where it was, and they were able to assess the greenness of what that environment was. So the greenness predicted the severity of symptoms, where the absence of greenness or the barrenness was associated with more symptoms, and greenness was associated with fewer symptoms. And then a more recent study, Faber-Taylor and Kuo studied 7 to 12-year-olds, and they were randomly assigned to 3 different conditions. So like with the adults in the previous study, they would engage in an activity that would fatigue their attention and then be randomly assigned to a walk in the park, a walk in a neighborhood, so imagine houses with trees around it, and then a walk in a downtown area. And children had improved attention and concentration after the park condition, significantly improved. There really wasn't a difference between the neighborhood and the downtown area. The one that was significantly different was the walk. And the effect size was comparable to methylphenidate, which is one of the most commonly prescribed medications for ADD. Now, the authors were very careful to caution and say they weren't recommending that kids went off their medication because there was a little bit of controversy after publication of this study, and so there was some exchange within the popular media, a number of radio interviews and newspaper and magazine coverage of this, but suggested that this could be a helpful complementary treatment. So children spending more time outdoors and particularly taking breaks during the day. Think about the potential effect of recess. And so one area that hasn't been explored is, is recess more effective when it's in a green environment versus a non-green environment? So I'm anticipating that future research will be examining this particular question. And the last study that I'm going to talk about today, actually the second to the last study, is a study that was done in the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago, and so it was public housing. And this essentially functions as a natural experiment because people are basically randomly assigned to a condition, meaning their window faces green space or not. Because when somebody is on a list for public housing, they're going to take the next unit available. They're not going to say, no, that one doesn't have a nice view, I'm not going to take it. And so when the Robert Taylor homes was built, there were trees and grass on all of the grounds, but over time, trees died and weren't replaced and grass wore away. So what they did was they hired and trained some of their residents to recruit, interview, and collect data because you want to the extent possible, match research participants to the characteristics of people who are interviewing them. It makes them more comfortable. So these were all long-term residents living in the Robert Taylor homes 19 years or more who were actually conducting the interviews. And they studied 18 buildings, and these buildings were sampled in order to omit some of the unique features. So for example, if the building was adjacent to a park beyond the housing complex that they had a view of, or police stations or stores and that sort of thing. And they only studied residents on the 2nd through 4th floors because they would have the maximum physical and visual access to trees and grass outside their building. So they didn't study anybody in apartments on the first floors. All of the participants were heads of household younger than 65 and female because those are the characteristics of 85% of the public housing residents. And they had a 92% response rate, which is actually really very high. If you have more than 50% response rate, and many research studies, you're doing a great job. But these are people who are very low income, living in poverty. So the average age was 34. Education was high school or GED, and they were earning less than $10,000 annually in 2001, which is still below the poverty line. The interviews were in the summer and fall in order to control for season. And as with some of the other studies, the nature around the building was assessed using photographs and multiple independent raters. So they were horticulture students, and they gave each environment a rating of 0 to 4, 0 meaning no nature and 4 meaning a great deal of grass and trees. So as with the other studies, they assessed their attentional capacity and their fatigue, and they used a method called the digit span backwards. And so the researcher reads a set of numbers, and the participant has to recite them back to the researcher but reverse the order. So if the researcher says 7, 6, 9, then the participant would have to say 9, 6, 7. And you start with a sequence of 2 and then go to 3, 4, 5, and 6, and so forth. And so the longest string that they can remember is interpreted as an indicator of attentional focus in this research. But it's also considered a measure of executive function because the individual has to also manipulate that string of numbers. They don't just need to remember them in that order, they need to reverse order. So, but it's also often used as a measure of attention. So the model that you're looking at here, the hypothesized associations are that the greenness of surroundings can influence the degree of attentional fatigue, which then can influence the effectiveness of coping. And they found some evidence to support this model. So the more green were the surroundings, the less attentional fatigue was demonstrated by these residents. And then an additional link is that those who were less fatigued were more effective in their coping. And that was measured in a variety of ways. So management of major life issues, their appraisal of how difficult or challenging their life stressors were. So those who were less attentionally fatigued rated their life stressors as less difficult and challenging. They reported taking more steps to address those challenges or goals. In other words, they were actively engaged in problem solving. And those who had less attentional fatigue reported that things had been a problem for a shorter period of time. On the other hand, those with more attentional fatigue, which were those who had less green surroundings, reported that their problems were more long-standing, that they weren't doing as much to try to address them, and they appraised them as much more difficult. And so the upshot of this research is that your physical surroundings, and in particular your contact with nature, can impact on a day-to-day basis the extent to which you're able to pay attention to and address your daily challenges. And then that has a cumulative effect over time. Now I mentioned that this is going to be the second to the last study that I was going to talk about, because there is actually one other study that I wanted to mention, which was college students. And the research paradigm was used similar to the others, where college students engaged in an activity that was designed to fatigue their attention, and then they were given the opportunity to rest and recover. They did cognitive assessments in their dorm rooms, and what they found was that college students with a dorm room that faced a natural setting had better attentional focus. So the take-home message here is think about where it is that you want to study, because you may be able to study more effectively in a place where you have a view of nature. So, in summary, the kinds of things that I've covered today really have to do with some of the mechanisms by which nature can enhance our physical, cognitive, psychological, and physiological well-being, and that some of the theory that can potentially explain that is the biophilia theory and also attention restoration theory. So, think about where you want to study, and think about where you want to spend your time. Think about what aspects of this research resonates with your nature immersion experience.